Welcome everyone to our 22nd webinar for the NATURA network. Today we are going to be hearing from Mike Treglia and Emily Maxwell from the Nature Conservancy on their recently released report called The State of the New York City Urban Forest. And then we're also going to be hearing from David Maddox on the Nature of Cities upcoming virtual festival, which NATURA is a co-sponsor for. So we can just start off with Mike and Emily. Take it away.
Great, thanks. And we're going to do the presentation jointly. So if we'll give Mike a moment to share his screen, and I'm coming in from somewhere with less bandwidth. So if for some reason y'all don't hear me, Mike is going to jump in, but just give us 1 second to get set up here. Awesome, thanks.
Y'all can see this first slide?
Yes.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah, and Mike, are you able to hand it over to me, or do you want to advance for me?
I can. Here you go.
Awesome. I love being in control of the screen. So good morning, everybody. I'm Emily Maxwell. I'm the director of the Cities program at the Nature Conservancy in New York, and really pleased to be here with you all this morning to present on our recently released report, The State of the Urban Forest in New York City. And let's just see if this will in fact advance. There we go. Great. So just briefly, for those of you who don't know us, the Nature Conservancy is a global organization, and our mission is to conserve the water, lands and waters on which all life depends. Our specific practice really focuses on cities in New York, and primarily New York City. This effort was part of a larger effort. I just want to put this in context because we are very much a practice that looks at the intersections of science and policy. It's truly about applied science. So our State of the Urban Forest in New York City report actually connects very deeply to an initiative to convene about 50 organizations across New York City to set an agenda for New York City's urban forest, which is our New York City Urban Forest agenda. And that coalition is called Forest for All NYC. So we have the science, we have the vision, and we have the people in the network to carry it forward. And that's tremendously important to us, that we're working in really that sort of praxis space. We always like to say, Mike and I are here to represent today, but we work with a big team. And so we always just like to take a moment and give them credit. I won't introduce them all to you, but all of these folks contribute to this effort over time. And then specifically for the State of the Urban Forest, while Mike and I are co-lead authors, it really did take a big team to put this all together, from the science and the research to the editorial and production. It also took, and some of you on this call could even be on this list, a really truly large number of reviewers to validate and make sure that what we're sharing with the world really can be a baseline for New York City to understand the current state of its urban forest. And these reviewers, rather than telling you about all of them, they really range from government agencies to academics to peers in the nonprofit space. And it was tremendously helpful. So when we sought to create this report, I'm going to give you a little bit of background, and then Mike is going to dive really deep on the geospatial dimensions of what we found. And then I'll talk about some of the policy and management findings as well. When we sought to do this, we ourselves as a team were looking for ways to understand fully the current state of the urban forest. And when we looked, we saw that there was tremendous research across a number of different elements of the forest, but there wasn't a comprehensive resource that we could point to and say, okay, this tells us the state, this gives us direction, this can help, elected officials, managers, advocates understand the current state and move forward. And we also wanted to look at the urban forest as a unique socio-ecological system, and not only the biophysical characteristics, but also the benefits it provides, equity and environmental justice dimensions, the current state of play of public policy and investment in it, how is it managed and stewarded, and what do New Yorkers think of it? And so we decided that we would put this together ourselves. And this is, it's version 1.0. We know there's going to be holes in it. We know there's going to be ways to improve it over time. But it also, in doing all that work, it did allow us to really summarize what we view as some of the strengths, challenges, and opportunities of the forest. I'm going to just give a quick scoop for those of you who might have to hop off early, that the forest is expanding and generally healthy. We're seeing some increases in street trees and canopy, which is fabulous. There's a fairly healthy size and species composition, and it provides us tremendous benefits, which is particularly important in a climate changing world of increasing heat waves and floods. There are many, many committed actors and institutions who care for it, advocate it, steward it, fund it. And over half of it is in New York City Parks Department management, which actually means it's better protected and has better management. The flip side of this is that there's a huge portion under private control, which really is subject to almost no requirements, no management, no stewardship. It is not equitably distributed. So some of our neighborhoods that have actually faced the most heat stress and more COVID stress may be sort of under-resourced with regards to the urban forest. The policy around the urban forest is patchwork, which means it not only is limited in its impact, but it's confusing for the public and a variety of stakeholders. And there's insufficient and unstable funding. We'll walk you through that a bit more later. And then, of course, there are persistent threats to it, particularly including climate change. So with that, today, we're going to share what's the urban forest, why does it matter in New York City, some of those key takeaways that I went through. We're going to go through them in more detail and then land with some strengths, challenges, and opportunities. So Mike, over to you. Thanks, y'all. Mike, are you able to give it back or?
Oh, I did not unmute. Let's see. All right, great. I think I've got control now. All right, thanks everybody for joining. It's really wonderful to see some familiar faces and see lots of new folks that I don't know on this call. So, we wanted to really consider the urban forest holistically, looking across not just the trees and their canopy, but also the physical and social infrastructure that support them. So, the stewardship, the policies, the other things that Emily was mentioning are part of this report. And we really leveraged work by the U.S. Forest Service in terms of creating this definition, to include the trees as well as the physical and social infrastructure that supports them. I'll note that we care about this resource because it provides so many benefits, especially in a place like New York City where there's lots of environmental challenges. It removes air pollution, it helps sequester carbon, decreases our temperatures, actually helps people's mental and physical well-being, reduces stormwater runoff challenges, provides habitat for different biodiversity, among other benefits. In a place like New York City, we're really lucky to have a huge wealth of data that we're able to use to understand this, and research, including by folks, on this call. So one key thing that we really leveraged was a tree canopy data set for New York City that was based on LiDAR, developed by the team at the University of Vermont Spatial Analysis Lab. And this allowed us to understand how canopy is distributed across the city. So overall, we found that based on the available data that there's about 22% canopy cover across the city as a whole. And that's of course not homogeneous, right? So Staten Island as a borough has the most by far, whereas Brooklyn has the least. You can see in different neighborhoods in a more granular scale on the right. This is a scale called neighborhood tabulation areas. There are some areas, especially like some of the parks, that have lots of tree canopy, like Central Park has, and the Van Cortlandt toward the Northern Bronx has a lot. But even some of the residential neighborhoods, like in the Western Bronx, has a lot of tree canopy, whereas areas like Eastern Queens, downtown Manhattan had relatively little. Using these data and other data for New York City, we're able to look at how the tree canopy and how the resource is ultimately distributed across different jurisdictions. And so on the left is a pie chart of land area by different types of jurisdictions. On the right is tree canopy. And ultimately what we find is that over 50%, about 55% is within city jurisdiction. And most of that is actually within New York City parks, either as parkland or rights of way, which are, street trees are overall managed by New York City Parks. You know, that's actually disproportionately more than the land area of kind of city government. You know, private property has a large portion of the canopy though, and that's really important to name. You know, about over a third of the canopy falls on private property of different types. You know, thankfully, the tree canopy data had been collected and developed in 2010 and 2017, enabling us to, you know, get a robust understanding of change through time, at least in this, you know, relatively short period, but, you know, still informative kind of context. So overall, the city increased in canopy about 2%, from about 20% to 22%. And, you know, you can see increases throughout most parts of the city. You know, some areas did, of course, lose canopy. In particular, some of the areas that were hit hard by Sandy, Superstorm Sandy, kind of along the coast of Queens and Brooklyn. And some of the biggest gains were actually in some of the areas that we see less canopy as of 2017, like in the South Bronx. You know, canopy change, we know, is driven by lots of different factors. We saw that most of the canopy growth, almost 90%, since 2010, occurred on the periphery of existing canopy, which actually suggests that a lot of the tree canopy gain that we see was attributable to kind of growth of existing trees. Of course, there's a lot of nuance, and we can't really precisely say how much was due to existing trees versus new plantings, but this is really, you know, impactful in telling. It kind of suggests that we might really need to, you know, maintain the trees that we've got to protect and maintain and increase tree canopy. Right. Of course, natural regeneration and tree plantings are an important component of canopy increases. You know, for the areas that we saw canopy losses in, there were a number of factors that might have driven it. You know, of course, in the coastal areas that were hit by Superstorm Sandy, we can think about, you know, how inundation and like wind and such from the storm impacted the urban forest in those spaces. So on this map, the blue area shows the inundation zone from Superstorm Sandy, and the white, which you see a lot of in that blue zone, is the loss of canopy. Right, there are a number of other factors that can drive canopy loss. Of course, you know, active removal for things like development, pests and pathogens, you know, in addition to some other different factors. You know, based on the available data for New York City, so New York City has you know, comprehensive inventories of street trees that are taken every 10 years, as well as the recent inventory of trees in landscaped portions of parks, so more of the areas with lawns that have trees kind of distinctly standing and managed. And, you know, overall, we can see that there's a healthy size distribution of those trees, right? This does not count for trees on private property, though other research has shown kind of similar trends. And basically what I mean by healthy size distribution is that we see a lot more trees overall in the younger size classes, the smaller size classes, which, you know, can grow and support older trees that may senesce out or, you know, have to be removed at some point. You know, we also see really healthy and diverse species composition in New York City. So, you know, this is figure showing the top 10 most common species within landscape portions of city parkland. But, you know, overall, the city sees, you know, an estimated, you know, almost 300 different kinds, including different species, genera, and varieties, depending on kind of how assessments are done. And in many ways, we've been seeing an increase in the diversity through time. For example, there's been an effort to diversify trees that are planted as street trees in New York City, and that's helped support that. And a lot of these trees are native, and, you know, especially trees in parkland and street trees are, you know, planted with the thought of being site appropriate. Right. I want to kind of bring us back to the canopy distribution and, you know, let you look for a brief second, especially at the map on the right, where you can see where we see the most canopy in the darker shades of green and the least in, you know, in the area, in the colors towards the white. Right. And we can think about what that means for equity issues and challenges that people face in their lived experience. And, now I'll go to a map of vegetation on the left, where it's showing tree canopy and grass and shrubs. And then on the right is land surface temperature. And this was, I believe, in a hot day on 2020. And ultimately, there's this well-defined relationship between vegetation and surface temperature, such that we see warmer temperatures in areas with less vegetation. Vegetation helps cool the environment through evapotranspiration by providing shade, and also just reflecting heat back. Has a different albedo and an absorbance of temperature of heat compared to lots of other surfaces in urban environments. Right, so this is like one way we can start thinking about how trees and their canopy affect local conditions and people's experiences. But we can look at these kind of dynamics in other ways as well. So we did a lot of analysis of equity of the urban forest in terms of where tree canopy and street trees are distributed, with things like the heat vulnerability index, which is specifically developed in New York City by the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, based not just on temperature, but also people's kind of health impacts as a result of heat waves, and social vulnerability developed by the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. And overall, what we largely see is that areas with lower canopy tend to have higher heat vulnerability and social vulnerability. And these trends vary a little bit by borough. So we can look at different and more specific variables. For example, in most boroughs, like we see with Brooklyn, there tends to be higher tree canopy in areas with higher income. Manhattan is actually an exception in a lot of cases, where there's actually higher canopy on the x-axis in areas with lower income, but that's again an exception. In general, across the city, we see kind of more canopy in wealthier areas. We can also look at things like street tree stocking rates, and in most areas that are more socially vulnerable have less street trees compared to what they likely could have. The Bronx is an exception, where it's had some targeted plantings, in the South Bronx in particular. And we know that some of these inequities are driven by long histories and legacies. Redlining, something that I know many folks on this call have looked at. Discriminatory lending practices, and basically, there's been a lot of work showing that areas that were redlined or were considered less suitable for home loans and such, for financing of home purchases and improvements, tend to have lower canopy today in many cases. And previous work has seen that holds true across New York City as a whole. And we looked specifically at a borough by borough level, and found that holds in all boroughs, where the areas graded D have less canopy than the areas graded A consistently, and that kind of trend holds, with Manhattan being the only exception. And there's been a lot of important progress that we can point to, with targeted tree plantings, like I mentioned, in the South Bronx. And of course, as trees are planted, it's important to think about nuances of gentrification that can be associated with greening, and how to avoid unintended consequences. So I'm going to pass this back to you, Emily. Sorry.
There we go. Sorry, I was having trouble unmuting with remote control. So, I think that the sort of spatial components that Mike just articulated, as well as some of the benefits and some of the other biophysical characteristics, really, they are a result of as Mike said, some historical dimensions of how our landscape has been affected by both physical decisions, but also social decisions. And they're also subject to current policy. And I want to name that the word policy means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So when we think about policy, we really think about rules and regulations, which is a little bit more standard, but we also think about government programs and initiatives and strategic plans. And just to give you all some examples of that, I think the rules and regulations are more straightforward, but strategic plans could be something like Plan YC or One NYC, these robust visions that effectively set policy direction through which then a variety of other policy decisions and budgetary decisions are made. And as you see here, and I'm not going to go through these in an exhaustive manner, there are a variety of policies that apply to our urban forest at the city, state, and federal level. And while in some ways we could see it as beneficial that trees in our urban forest are embedded in many different policies, it also can be a very confusing landscape for both agencies and also the public in terms of how they need to treat trees on their own property respectively. So I will, again, these are all, if you're somebody who likes to dive deep on policy, we do go through these in more robust background in the report itself. See if I can actually move the screen, but happily, a large portion, so 53.5% of our urban forest is under New York City Parks jurisdiction. And just to re-articulate what Mike has shared, a good chunk of that, about 28.5%, is in our city parks themselves. And the other 25% or so that they own is in our rights of way, primarily street trees. And so these trees in particular, sorry, let me stay there for a moment, are actually limited by sort of regulatory authority in terms of the ability to remove them. And what that looks like is it's not actually forbidden to remove them, but if you're not the Parks Department themselves, you need a permit to remove trees, and you are subject to replacement requirements. And those replacement requirements, they're not like one tree lost, plant one tree. They are thankfully a bit more sophisticated than that and really try to sort of anticipate the magnitude of the loss given the size of the tree and to replace that more in kind. So that's a real benefit, but the other land types largely are not subject to those requirements. Sorry, my cursor is a little finicky here, but there are sort of one other set of areas that we wanted to call out, which is there are, through New York City zoning regulations, a set of what's called special purpose districts. And these are areas that have sort of special geological or ecological features that are subject to more stringent, and in fact, some of the only replacement requirements or limits on removal that actually span across a variety of property types, including private property. Excuse me. And so, you'll observe that many of these districts are actually in Staten Island, which might make sense in terms of those are areas that have more of those characteristics. There's also a portion, in a couple of small portions in other parts of the city. And while we think this is terrific, I will note that in some ways, what this can continue to do is facilitate disparity by protecting those neighborhoods that are already more green and like allowing removal without replacement in other areas. So in essence, it would be really interesting to see the regulations that apply in special purpose districts apply more broadly across the landscape as a whole. And so, another major part of policy really has to do with budgetary decisions. And I'm sorry for the inside baseball on this slide. There is a bit of it, but so in New York City, our budget is split by capital and expense. And in our expense budget, what OTPS stands for is other than personal services. So this is like not staff expenses. This really is like the hard goods. And so when we look at our over $40 billion budget from fiscal years 18 to 22, and we average it, we see that the New York City Parks forestry budget is quite tiny. And that while the Parks Department budget itself is very small, under 1%, which there is a campaign to raise that budget above 1% or more of the total city budget, the forestry side of that budget is even smaller, and something that we're seeking to address. But more than just being small, the budget is also quite insecure and unstable. And so when we look back to 2006, and this includes both capital, so the kind of like the durable goods, and the expense side for more maintenance things, we see that there are real peaks and valleys in this funding. And while of course in fiscal year 21, there's a big drop due to COVID, that's not the only year that there's a drop. And so we really want to point out that when you have an asset like an urban forest that requires consistent ongoing maintenance, both for the health of the forest and the benefits that it provides, but also for public safety reasons, that you really do want to have consistent ongoing programs for its care and maintenance, which does include ongoing planting, since it is largely a human managed system. And so we'll also note that another area that we attempted to look at, but that candidly is quite hard to research because a lot of it is just not sort of publicly available information, is it's not just the public that spends on our urban forest. It's also, there are private sources. Some people are crowdsourcing for the tree guards on their blocks through sources like IOB, which is an online crowdfunding platform for local environmental initiatives. There are initiatives that help local stewards like Partnerships for Parks to actually care for trees on their blocks. And of course, Million Trees NYC, which was a large public and privately funded initiative to plant 1 million more trees that wrapped up in 2015, New York Restoration Project did raise about $30 million for plantings. And so we know that private sources will necessarily need to complement public sources, but public sources really need to be the lion's share of our funding. But this slide, Mike and I really have thought about this slide for several years now, actually. And what we want to convey to you all here is just to take in for a moment how complex the landscape of management of our urban forest is. We have areas that are wholly managed by the Parks Department. We have areas that are wholly managed by private actors. We have areas that are hybrid, both in terms of you have one owner, but you have a different manager, or you have one owner and you have a co-manager. You have areas that are wholly unknown and not understood, like trees in backyards, but that actually do make up an important part of our urban forest. And then you have areas like forested natural areas that have a tremendous private partner, Natural Areas Conservancy, who's both caring for and advocating them, but who doesn't have full funding to do the management that they need. And so what we want you to take away from this slide, rather than the detail, is that when we're thinking about an asset or a system, really as a whole socio-ecological system, and then you have this diversity of actors, it does become challenging to both fully understand it and to effectively manage it. So we'll, just take a moment here and say that the Parks Department does, though, manage the assets on their land quite effectively. We're a fan of what they're doing, and we think there's potential to emulate some of it. It doesn't mean it's perfect, but they do have, their street trees and park trees, for example, on a pruning cycle. They are doing ongoing restoration work. They're doing ongoing trail maintenance work. And again, not all of that is done solely by the Parks Department, but it's certainly done by their leadership. They also, facilitate a tremendous amount of stewardship activities that really does help connect members of the public to their urban forest. And that can be out in their more wild forested natural areas, and also with street trees. And I'll just note that these activities are certainly not only done by New York City parks. They're also done by the tremendous network of environmental stewardship groups that span our city. And what you're seeing now is, and some of you might be familiar with the US Forest Service StewMap project, but this is an effort to really understand the network of stewardship groups out there. It's in many cities now, but this is the New York network. And so we see groups across the city caring for and advocating trees and the urban forest in their communities, which makes a tremendous difference and is something we can continue to invest in. But some of the good news, and we don't actually mean to be trite, is that a lot of the research out there, when we think about how people feel about our urban forest, it tells us like generally people often like trees and nature. And what you're seeing here is just a variety of mostly homemade signs that New Yorkers make and put in their tree beds because they care about the tree right in front of their building or on their block. And so we think that this kind of creative sort of local advocacy tells us how people feel about their trees. But there's also other things to say. And recently, and we really will credit Urban Systems Lab with this research, and I see Chris and Timon here, research was conducted regarding the use of parks during COVID. And one of the things that told us is that New Yorkers love their parks for being able to sit in shade. And to sit in shade, we really need our urban forest. And consistently, while we don't have a ton of data on people's attitudes specifically about trees on the urban forest in New York City, when we look at that research more broadly, globally, we do see that people in cities do tend to really appreciate and care for their urban forest. But we also know that New Yorkers engage about their trees. And these are correspondence related to tree plantings during the early years of Million Trees NYC. And candidly, while many of these are complaints, that doesn't mean they're about a tree being bad. And we see this actually as like demonstrating a relatively engaged public who will actually reach out to their city administrative officials to talk about tree planting. And so we think that's an opportunity to activate the public more effectively. But there is a lot we don't know. And I think one of the biggest takeaways for Mike and I and for the team was the tremendous both opportunity and challenge that private property does present to us in terms of the urban forest. So while accounting for just over 48% of total citywide land, it also accounts for nearly 36% of total canopy. And a very large portion of this is in 1 to 2 family homes, also multifamily residential. And then there are importantly some public facilities and institutions, think botanical gardens and cemeteries, that hold a tremendous amount of canopy. Some of these actors might be more easy to collaborate with because they already have a practice in this effort, like for example, Greenwood Cemetery or Evergreen Cemetery, the botanical gardens. But how do we effectively reach out and engage 1 to 2 family homeowners is a huge amount of effort and knowledge that we need to actually generate as a community in order to design effective programs. So I'm going to speak pretty fast these last couple slides because I want to keep us on time. But so we've talked about the urban forest, to why it matters, key takeaways, strengths, challenges, and opportunities is where we'll go next. So we do have a healthy and expanding forest. We have diverse people and institutions stewarding it. We have strong leadership from New York City Parks. We have huge expansion opportunities. It's inequitable. The policies are inconsistent. There's insufficient and insecure funding. There's limited knowledge about New York City residents' attitudes. Climate change, pests, and diseases are real threats. Briefly, our urban forest agenda, we can always talk about that another time. We encourage you to take a look at it. It sets forth 12 actions developed by nearly 50 organizations to help address a lot of what Mike and I have talked about today. So with that, I think we will wrap, and we so appreciate your time and your engagement this morning. And I guess we have some Q&A if a couple minutes. And Tessa, I assume we let you moderate that.
Yes, yes. Thank you so much, Emily and Mike. That was a great presentation. Feel free to just unmute yourself, or if you feel more comfortable putting your question in the chat, please do so. We have a few minutes for that.
And I see a question about funding, which is funny because Mike and I noted that we didn't have a funding slide. This report was primarily funded by Helmsley, which is a foundation who funds our Future Forest NYC initiative.
Hey, it's Nancy Grimm here. Sorry, I'll unmute my video. No, I won't. Thank you very much for your nice presentation. That was quite informative. I was just going to ask about the 45%, I guess it is, of the New York forest that's privately owned. This is actually true in a lot of cities, I think, where you have a lot of privately owned trees and so forth. And I guess what I'm wondering is what kind of things is the city doing to encourage stewardship of those private lands?
Yeah, so I can touch on this briefly, and Mike, feel free to jump in. So in those special purpose districts, there are limitations on removal, and if trees are removed, they have to be permitted, and they're subject to either significant replacement requirements, or you can pay an in lieu fee, but that's a really small portion of the city. And so historically there have been some things like tree giveaways to incentivize tree planting on private property, but candidly beyond that, there's not necessarily a lot of programmatic initiatives like how to care for your tree. There are of course things like public education around things that are quite pestilent, right? Like emerald ash borer was a big campaign, but there aren't actually rigorous programs. And I think that's one of the areas that we identify as an opportunity.
Great. Thank you.
I'll also note that I see in the chat why 30% as a cover goal. And I'll say that maybe you'll have us back someday. That's quite a long answer. The brief answer is we have some to be released research, which we're terming our practical canopy analysis, that looked at the potential for canopy practically under current landscape constraints. And Mike really led this, but it's extensive, so we need a little time to chat about it in depth. Understanding that sort of modeled approach to what was feasible, we then applied some sort of political and other constraints to it in a expert driven conversation to set a goal within a certain amount of time. And so we realized that this is both ambitious and visionary. We're at 22% now, so it'd be a lot to grow, but we wanted something ambitious, but also achievable.
And the one thing I'll add on that is that, the 30% is specifically by 2035 and not seen to limit what we want to strive for, but, let's get there and hopefully we can expand a lot more from there.
Awesome. Well, it looks like we are at time to start David's presentation. If anyone has other questions, please put them in the chat, or maybe Emily and Mike, if you feel comfortable with sharing your email, people can reach out to you directly. That'd be great.
Cool. Am I on?
Yes.
You're all right, David.
Hi, everybody. I'm David Maddox. I lead something called the Nature of Cities in New York. We're based in New York. We are a large international NGO, about 900 writers from around the world, very transdisciplinary. And we're running a festival. This is our third big international event. We did the first one in Paris 3 years ago. And the next plan was to be another in-person event in Bogota the following year. COVID changed everything, and we went virtual, and we had our first virtual event last February. And I will tell you, I'm going to say this a couple of times over the course of this brief talk, we are all in on virtual, and for a particular reason. We want to lower barriers to participation around the world. One of the biggest barriers to participation for international conferences and conversations is travel. The cost of travel, the carbon of travel, the time of travel. So for us, we are intent on remaining a virtual event that welcomes everyone from wherever they are and meets them where they are in the kind of engagement that they can actually participate in. So the nature of cities, the critical word for the nature of cities for us is the word of. It's not the nature in cities. We are the nature of cities. And that's, in that sense, nature becomes modified to be the character of cities through a green lens most of the time for us. But still, it's about communities, it's about infrastructure, it's about green, it's about blue, it's about the character of cities, the kind of cities that we want to create. And that's the intended vibe of the festival, which will happen in March. These are our constellation of sponsors, including the NATURA network. Thank you very much, NATURA network. Global and diverse and transdisciplinary in all of these approaches. Some are community organizations, some are science organizations, some are land management organizations. We intend to we are intentional about trying to welcome and creating a space for many different ways of knowing, many different modes of action. If you went to the festival in February, you saw this. This was the way people got into the festival last time. You would come here. It's a drawing by an artist we love and use a lot, Frida Larios, Salvadoran woman who lives in Washington, D.C. This was what we call the imagined city. And one of the characteristics of it was a place that we all imagined we kind of like to be. It looks a lot like Antigua and kind of is Antigua with modern elements. But you would come here and you'd click on stuff and you'd navigate your way to wherever you were going. I'm going to come back to this idea, this picture in a few minutes when I talk about what's different about the festival that's coming up. This was the characteristics of the festival from last fall. There were a lot of people who came, over 2,000 people, lots of sessions. The beating heart of the Nature of Cities Festival. We have plenaries, sure, but the beating heart of the festival is the idea of small group workshops. We call them seed sessions, or virtual field trips. And a virtual field trip, the way it works is that a person will walk the route as they would on a regular in-person field trip, with their phone or some other device and filming the route without narrating it. And then when the field trip actually happens in the session, they play the film and narrate it live. They can pause the film, they can have conversations, they can generate conversations with the people who are part of the field trip. And then we have these thing called seed sessions. Small group, generally 10, 15, maybe more people who are gathering around an idea. I specifically want to point your attention to that snaky diagram over on the right. Those are the different types of people who came to the festival from all over the world last time. And this is a goal for us, and it's something I'm also very proud of. This idea that many different people, many different types of people, many ways of knowing and modes of action are all gathering together in joined conversations. Because for me, one of the things I believe fundamentally is through collaboration, we might create something we could not have created by ourselves. And so we want to seek out the fuzzy boundaries between different ways of knowing and points of view, because we can discover something new there and create something we could not have created before. That is a fundamental value proposition for the Nature of Cities. That was last February. Next March, it's starting to evolve. We expect more like 3,000 people this time. It's going to be 3 days rather than 5, 24 hours a day, multiple languages, 11 plenaries, but about 240 workshop sessions and field trips. Lots of art embedded everywhere. Even our plenaries, there are plenary keynotes. Some of them are listed there. We also have dialogues in plenary and art engagements, shoulder to shoulder with everything. Ours is a festival about ideas. It's also meant to be different points of view next to each other. That's a critical aspect for us. I mentioned a lot of this, the different kinds of engagements we're interested in. There's plenaries, sure, but we are meant not to be a talk at you conference. This is meant to be a conference, an event in which people talk to each other in various contexts. Seed sessions, skill sessions, which tilt a little more toward presentation. Field trips, art, micro talks, 4-minute short video talks that are available on demand throughout the festival. Those submissions are still open. So for those of you who want to participate in a micro talk, to create a micro talk, that's still available now. And there'll be film screens around our virtual space that you could see those all the time. There's 240 sessions that we're going to have over these over across 24 hours, across 3 days. These are some of the ones that have come from the NATURA network. So that have been proposed by this group. It's a big lift. Nature Cities is a tiny organization, but we do it by having a constellation of paid and in-kind curators around the world that help us with language questions, with regional content, making sure that we are having conversations that are globally relevant, but also connect to local issues and regional issues as well. One of our curators is here with us. J.D. Brown is one of the curators that we have from around the world to help us with this. This is the only way we can do a festival, an event as big as this, is by having lots of help like this. This is one thing that's going to be different about the festival. There's a lot of content, and one of the things that we're going to do is have streams of content, which we call communities, and all of the sessions will be tagged as communities. People will be able to join communities, and doesn't restrict anyone's ability to flow around the event, but it helps people find stuff that they're interested in, and helps people navigate and talk to each other in logical groups. What you'll notice is that these communities are not discipline based, they are idea based, and they are thematically based. This is pretty much the constellation of communities I think we will have. They're going to change a little bit maybe, but this will help us make sense of a very large constellation of content. Okay, one of the challenges of virtual events is the lack of contact, the lack of physical contact, right? And however beautiful that imagined city was that I showed you at the beginning, that Frida showed us, you arrived there at the festival, you saw the thing that you wanted to do, and you say, okay, I'm going to a seed session. I click on seed session, I find the seed session I'm going to, I navigate to it, and finally you get to a Zoom meeting that looks kind of like this, like we're here, and you finally see people. But the problem is you haven't seen a soul. You haven't passed anybody along the way. And that is one of the frustrations about virtual meetings. It's one of the things that we miss about going to an in-person meeting, in which you arrive at the lobby, you're walking through the lobby on the way to wherever you're going, and you see other people. And you can talk to them even if they're not in your session. All right, so the biggest thing that we're going to change in the festival is how we interact with each other in between the kinds of sessions that we have. If you went to the festival last year, you might have gone to someplace we called the garden. In that picture, there was a tree in the middle of that picture, and there was a door in that tree. And if you clicked on that door, you would go to this place we call the garden. That place was this. It's a spatial chat platform called Topia. It's designed the way we want it to be designed. And one of the critical features of spatial chat software is that you can see and talk to people you're standing next to. And if you walk somewhere else in the world, the people you were standing next to, they disappear for you, and you can walk somewhere else and join a different group and talk to them. Everything, this is the lobby for us in the new meeting. When you arrive at the Nature of Cities Festival, you will land, we're redesigning it so it's not gonna look exactly like this, but you will land in a place like this. You will know you're going to say room 1. but you're going to pass a bunch of people on the way because everybody else is here going to their thing. I'm going to room 1. I see Timon and I say, hey, Tom, what's up? And where are you going? And Timon says, oh, I'm going to room 3. Okay, well, we'll see you at the party later. There will be film screens around here. There'll be art. The micro talks that I mentioned before will be playing around this space. And the sponsors will have spaces here. They'll little sponsor zones where they'll have a sign and a film screen and an interior world, which we're designing as a tree house, where people would go in and be able to climb up into a tree and kind of like a clubhouse where they could have their own, they could have get-togethers, meetups, and also sessions. This is a core idea for us, is to try to recreate some of the more improvisational, casual interactions that we often miss in in-person meetings. So we still have the more formal things in Zoom or in interior rooms, but we can also have these casual, improvisational, moving groups back and forth. This is an idea of the kind of thing we'll embed around the world are things like Miro boards and analogs of blank walls with spray paint, where people can put their ideas up and suggest things to each other, talk to each other in ways that we tend to miss in classic virtual meetings. This is more the style of what the new Topia world is going to look like: a little more spare, a little more colorful, and with more wayfinding about how to get people back and forth. It's a big world, and it will be very fractal for us. So where people land in the north, east, south, and west corners and make their way to wherever we're going. And we actually want them to make their way to wherever they're going so that they can pass people along the way. I'm going to stop there. One of the things that we want to do is it's a festival about ideas. You know, sometimes I hear from people, "Ah, God, it's like a bunch of hippies going to a science conference," and said, no, it's actually a conference about ideas in which we welcome and engage with ideas that are different from the ones that we often encounter in our regular discipline-driven lives. And so, in the spirit of trying to learn something new from someone who uses different words, different language, has a different set of motivations and methods of working. In those ways, we might be changed by the interactions we have with them. We welcome everybody to come to this festival. A lot of people are going to be there. And we hope that, and we're very grateful for Natura Network's support last festival and this one. And we welcome everybody to come participate in what we've got going on, and have micro talks there, and bring your ideas and good spirits to what we're up to. Thanks for this opportunity to talk about it. Go to tnoc-festival.com. You can see more. Registrations are going to be open soon. Another element of lowering barriers to participation is multiple languages, 24 hours a day, and the fact that it's, although we ask for people to pay, there is an easy route to getting in for free. So even money is not a barrier to participation for us. We want, if paying $10 or $20 to come to the festival is a barrier, it's not. Come for free and bring your good spirit and ideas. Thanks. I think I have a minute or so for questions. And I'll try to answer some of them ones in the chat as well. What do you think?
That sounds awesome.
We love it.
I think it's going to be a gas.
Can't wait.
David, are we still going to have this this crazy 24/7? You know, 24. I don't know how many days it is, but around the clock.
It's
kind of.
Yes, it is. It's 20. Last time it was 24 hours a day for 5 days, and that just about killed us. This time it's going to be 3 days, 24 hours a day. We got a very generous grant from the Forest Service, so U.S. Forest Service.
Excellent. I think we lost David.
And
Yeah.
so all the plenaries are going. Really? We're gone?
No, we're here.
You're frozen for a bit.
Oh, okay.
You're back.
So, lots of translation sessions are in multiple languages, and many of the sessions can also have individual translations as well. So again, it's this element of lowering barriers to participation. Yeah, that's it.
Quick question on that translation bit, David. Is it going to be like the live translation at the bottom of the screen again?
No, that did not go so well from our point of view. It's actually going to be live in-person translation this time.
Gotcha.
So we actually have physical in-person translations. I loved the idea of that AI-based translations. We were ill-served by our vendor, and it seems like a technology that's not quite right. So we're going back to old-fashioned.
David, I had a question that I put in the chat. It's about the communities, which I think is an excellent idea. They have these kind of things in AGU meetings that are called threads or something like that. But I really like the idea. Can we, as session proposers, are we going to be given the option to sort of identify the communities we think we're relevant to?
Yes, if when you submit sessions, there's all the list I just showed you is there, and you choose the ones you want, as many
great.
as you want.
I just exposed myself as somebody who submitted a session via someone.
Yep. And the program will be out in a couple of weeks, February 1st. That's also when registration's open. And everybody who registers will be able to go back and see all the sessions that are there and start to sign up for them. You know, one of the struggles of virtual meetings is people who sign up for stuff and then don't show up for stuff. It's everybody has this trouble, and so we're getting better this time about doing things like calendar invites, and these communities are a way for us also to be able to communicate directly with people about saying, hey, you signed up for this. Here's some other stuff in this community that you might be interested in.
Love it. It's a good idea.
Any other questions that I missed? I'm going to put my email in there in the chat. I welcome communication from anybody, and if you have any questions, let me know. We would love to see you there.
Yes, and we're at time. Thank you so much, David, for that presentation. Very, very informative, and it's making me excited to go to the festival. Also, Emily and Mike, again, thank you so much for your presentation as well. I hope everyone has a good rest of their day or night.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks all.
Thanks, everybody.
You have a good week.
Bye.
Safe.
Take care.